If you all can introduce yourself, just in brief.
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Tejasvi. Hi, I'm Tejasvi. And I am asexual. I'm on the spectrum, and I'm also autistic. And I'm someone who has been in therapy on and off for almost 6 years now. And queer affirmative therapy has definitely been something that I've only found in the therapy room. As a concept, of course, I've known about it for a while, but I've only found it as a service for myself over the past year or so.
Okay.
Should I nominate someone else? I nominate Shruti.
Sure, thank you. So I'm incidentally Archa's colleague at the Alternative Story, and I've lived with mental health issues discernibly to me since the age of 17, and struggle with navigating the mental health industrial complex, as it were, for a long time. I happen to also live with, I like how this is a CV, but I happen to also live with borderline personality disorder and ADHD and recurrent depression disorder, and I identify on the ACE spectrum. And I also live with my cat, who's asleep like right behind me, and I'm hoping she doesn't disturb the meeting at any point. But yeah, and yeah, I think that's about it.
I hope she does.
Prabjot, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi, I'm Prabjot. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a queer affirmative therapist. I'm working with Karma Center for Counseling and Wellbeing. We're a queer affirmative place. And I recently did my queer affirmative counseling practices course from Mariwala Health Initiative. So I've worked with the Humsafar Trust in some capacity to offer mental health services to the queer community. So I've been working with the community for a while now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sunanda. I use they and she pronouns. I'm also on the A spectrum, the Aero spectrum. I identify on the non-binary spectrum. I'm on a lot of spectrums. I'm also a therapist. I currently am practicing in the US, where I just completed my training like last year. And I specialize in working with queer folks, and because I'm in white people country, I try and work with queer people of color. And I run a support group for folks identifying on the asexual aromantic spectrum. So talking about queer affirmative therapy is what I practice and I love doing. So I'm excited to be here.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just start. To begin with, we all know that access to mental health care is important for everyone, especially for queer folks, because our needs can be varied and it requires some level of sensitivity. I personally also have faced issues when it comes to therapy. Therapists being sensitive to asexuality in particular, as someone who's also lived with trauma. So what are some barriers that you have observed in therapy, and what are some ways that you think we can overcome it as a patient or as a therapist yourself?
I was thinking I'd go first because this is something that I strongly feel about. I feel like when it comes to sex education, when it comes to talking about sex, obviously, most institutions in our country, especially educational institutions, don't talk about sex from a point of view of pleasure, from a point of view of agency, from a point of view of consent. It's usually like, don't have sex. If you have sex, wear protection, things like that. So I think obviously it would have helped for me to have that validation from a young age, where I'm told that not wanting to have sex or not feeling sexual attraction to certain people, I mean most people at most times, is something that is normal, and still wanting to engage in sex is absolutely okay. Still being curious about sex is absolutely okay. So I actually found out that I was ace when I was about 23 or 24, because I would not be sexually attracted to any of my partners. Sure, I'd be curious, but I'd never feel what I was supposed to feel, that was described in erotica or that was described in, by my friends. Sometimes I would, but that is something I discovered much later, that I was gray sexual and not, someone who was sex repulsed. But that's a different conversation. But what really helped me was, I'm obviously a journalist as well. So I went online and I spoke to a bunch of ace people to talk about how they came into their ace identity and how do they know they were ace and what is their ace experience. And that I actually documented it as part of an anthology of sorts on my Medium profile. And that's how I came to know that even within the ace spectrum, there are varied experiences. Some people wanted sexual experiences. Some people were aro and ace. So they maybe did not want romantic experiences, but they wanted sexual experiences, or a permutation of all of that. So patient advocacy really helps for me to tell my there have been times when I've told my therapist and sometimes psychiatrists as well that what you are saying is completely invalid, making me feel invalidated. And obviously, as the person living with the experience, I'm the person who knows the best. Even so, a lot of psychiatrists and therapists respond with feeling like I'm challenging their expertise and things like that. So that is definitely something that I feel like we ought to sensitize therapists and psychiatrists about, where we tell them that don't make the it's important to not make the client feel invalidated. I had a psychiatrist who once told me, if you don't open up, I'm going to put you on medication. And that sounded like a threat to me. And I was just like, I am paying your fees, I'm telling you, and I'm autistic. Now that I have realized that I'm autistic much later, I'm like, it's really hard for me to put out my emotions and verbalize my emotions, even though I'm a good speaker when it comes to ideas, and when it comes to my own emotions, I'm not that verbal. So all of those situations, it just happened to me that I happened to be in a place where I had agency, or I felt very strongly and I was able to challenge. I'm also a mental health journalist, so I had spoken to a lot of people on different kind of issues, and yeah, that was a threat. And yeah, so I was able to kind of advocate for myself. But I can also imagine someone much younger than me feeling completely invalidated, feeling completely threatened, intimidated, and not feeling like there's something wrong with them, especially if the psychiatrist and therapist is also telling them so. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question directly, but that was my experience.
No, I mean, like I said, that is one of the barriers to getting proper therapy, right? Having your experience being invalidated is, I think, number one, and it also.
And also this idea of sex being penis and vagina, that is the end goal of sex. That's the only way you can have sex. That is so bizarre. Like, sex can be so much more. Some people might not engage in penis and vagina penetrative sex because of whatever reasons. Maybe they have vaginismus, maybe they have another issue like PCOS or whatever, some pain, some chronic health issue or disability that does not allow them to feel pleasure that way. Maybe sexting is also a form of sex, and that's could be stimulating for some people. So just understanding that that's the act of sex can be so varied, and it is always about the pleasure of the people involved, is definitely something I feel like therapists and psychiatrists could use with understanding.
Can I add to that? Yeah. All right. So I was just thinking how assumption amounts to erasure in so many ways, like Tejasvi was talking about how even people on the A spectrum, just the A spectrum, can have so many different experiences. So even if the therapist is, let's say, sensitive towards queer reality, sensitive towards what it means to be on the spectrum, but just assumes that, okay, this could be the sexual behavior, this could be how the person chooses to exert or assert their ace identity. I think this becomes such a huge barrier just overall, for queer individuals, because there's this fear that I look like a cisgender female. So, I mean, this assumption that I must be heterosexual, or this entire story that people create just by looking at you. or if you share one part of your identity and the story that follows that part of your identity, I think that is nothing less than erasure. And then for a queer affirmative space to be safe more than anything, that erasure, that assumption has to just completely go out of the window. It is all about what is it that the person is bringing up sitting in front of you, and not what is it that you're assuming just by looking at them or just by tiny pieces of information that they have shared. So you don't narrate the story, you completely exclude yourself from the person's narrative. I think unless and until that is done, and that can be like such a huge barrier to queer folks accessing therapy.
Um, I think I want to add on to this piece of accessibility, because I agree with what everyone is saying. And I think I also find myself taking a further step back and being like, we need to be talking about queer affirmative therapy, yes, and I will talk about my thoughts around that in a minute. But I also want to talk about accessibility of therapy as a whole. I was around 19, and I had a really close friend of mine die by suicide. I got in a space where I was really not doing very well and needed a therapist. I finally got a therapist who I actually liked by the time I was 22. It took 3 years for me to find a good therapist, and half a dozen bad ones. And Tejasvi, I so related to that aspect of feeling threatened by a psychiatrist, because after I'd had multiple bad experiences, I went in and was to a new psychiatrist, and I was like, fine, I will try medication, but I will try it for an X amount of time because I've had bad experiences. And he literally laughed in my face. So these are the kind of experiences folks have had, much worse than this. I have so many stories of bad therapists, psychiatrists, people who don't have training in basic like validation and basic just creating a warm space. So like and there's such few therapists to start with, especially for marginalized communities, that like when I think about queer affirmative therapy, I kind of think that therapists have a responsibility beyond the therapy space, of creating more environments, whether it's through support groups or whether it's through trainings to help people communicate better amongst themselves, to help people in the community be able to create spaces. So it's not just the professionals who are doing the work, but we're helping folks be able to do the work for themselves and for each other. This is one of my long-term goals when I have a little bit more footing in my field, but it's something I feel strongly about. As for queer affirmative therapy itself, and on ACE experiences, a good therapist can be transformative. My therapist, the one I still work with, who took me 4 years to find, was the first person who told me I didn't have to have sex if I didn't want to. She didn't use the word ace. I don't asexual. I'm not even sure she knew about it. I mean, she knew the basics, but it blew my mind. I came in with such distress of like I feel like I'm doing relationships wrong. I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know what's going on. And she's just like, you know what? If this is causing you distress, don't do it. And I was like, whoa, I could do that? What are you saying? That it blew my mind completely. From my training, one of the things which I think therapists forget is that we might have experience and expertise in guiding, in helping folks open up. But the thing which I keep emphasizing is that I cannot be the expert in your experience. You are the expert in your experience, and I am the expert in helping you guide, explore it. But that kind of like working on balancing the power dynamics in the space, I think is so important, especially for queer folks, especially for ACE folks, because I mean, even a therapist who says they're queer affirmative or is, I would question whether they're ace affirmative, because I don't always trust that queer folks even know about asexuality enough.
Yeah. No, I just want to touch upon what Prabjot said for a second about how presumptions can play a huge role in therapy, in the space of therapy, and how even if you know about things like asexuality or anything, bisexuality or whatever, it shouldn't be fit into boxes, and how presumptions of how what it is and your client having to fit into that box of what you think asexuality looks like is harmful. And I think with people who have been through trauma, and they have to face a lot of this in therapy when they talk about their asexuality, it's always questioned whether it's due to trauma or it's actually asexuality. I know my experiences were questioned. I was told it was just trauma and it was not asexuality at all. What are the things that, I mean, these are some misconceptions that even queer affirmative therapists have. How to get around them, how to work around them. Can what are your thoughts on that?
I'd like to pitch in.
Yeah.
I think something that has occurred to me fairly recently has been that in so many ways, um, the ways in which I now think of myself sort of lacks self-compassion in several different ways. And because I happen to live with certain chronic mental illnesses, I often can be very, very driven in thinking of therapy and thinking of psychiatry as a rehab 101 space, as opposed to a thing that is perhaps allowing me to be more me. Because in so many ways, and this will briefly touch upon BPD, because in so many ways, part of my diagnosis is extremely gendered in nature, and paints me as somewhat hysterical, or paints people who have a personality disorder as somewhat hysterical. So as it so happens, sex is seen as, you're initially seen as someone who's actually rather given to being promiscuous and given to engaging in extremely risky behavior. And I feel like my primary interaction with mental health professionals led to me sort of thinking of myself as someone who leans into bad situations, into quote unquote bad situations. And in so many ways, the onus of making myself better or changing myself or sort of curing myself of BPD or whatever rested very much on me, even in terms of literature available online that paints it. So in many ways, my asexuality happened to be as a result of, as a combination of the side effect of psychiatric medication, of the sort of condition of the very shame filled conditioning that I have from my family when it comes to romance and pleasure, from the pathologization that I received in my diagnosis and in different narratives that I was presented by mental health professionals of what it means for a woman with BPD to be engaging in sex at all. And in a very sort of forceful corrective behavior of engaging only in things that are good for me, so on and so forth. So my engagement with mental health professionals sort of, the more I sought out help for myself, the further away any situation where I could access pleasure with any form of safety was for me. And it's only rather recently that I happened to start accessing therapy from a therapist who actually expressed anger at the sort of misinformation I received from various other therapists who, and the reason it's interesting is because the idea of textbook, this person seeks out emotionally unavailable people, and this person uh, behaves in a certain way, and how it sort of shifts the onus onto you, and creates a particular situation where you are responsible for the the decisions that you make. So, and I think to a certain extent, it's interesting because all of this leads to pathologization, and then eventually, when you do talk about the fact that you identify on the ACE spectrum, it sometimes feels like yet another label that ends up somewhat othering yourself from who you wish to express yourself to be, because a diagnosis can in many ways can feel is a double-edged sword, simply because it feels so relief inducing on the one hand, but also it requires you to insert more medical terminology in your language, and because identifying as asexual in many ways has caused me to feel a high sense of loneliness um, in who I am and in my peer group and in the world of dating and romance. And because that sense of isolation from community was already so stark, I don't know how to talk about pleasure. I don't know how to talk about wanting to access pleasure at all. And I often don't find that validation um, from psychiatrists in particular, but also very often therapists who might talk about a lot of the choices that I make as a function of my trauma. So I feel like sometimes I even wish to stop using any of the labels that I rather proudly own otherwise, and sometimes just talk about my experiences of loneliness and isolation. Sometimes I now personally, on a very, very context specific basis, can find that uh, talking about certain labels automatically makes me move into a rabbit hole of othering and pathologization, and perhaps it's useful for me to not even mention uh, labels after a point. Um, but sometimes when you live with a certain amount, when you carry a certain amount of trauma in your body, the only way in which you know how to draw boundaries is to also act from a defensive point. When you draw a boundary, you may not always be coming from a space of strength. And so the label of asexuality is also incredibly important to me. Yeah, I mean, I realize that wasn't a direct answer to what you were asking, Archa, but I think I'm just talking about my experience with mental health professionals in general, and how, even though something it has helped me in so many ways, it has also been incredibly harmful uh, in many ways that I possibly didn't recognize up until very recently. Yeah.
No, I think that's important to understand as well. That I also want to ask the therapist, what do you think about giving out labels in to queer folks too fast, maybe that they might not be ready for, and how can that be harmful sometimes, or how can that be useful sometimes as well? I'm sorry if you hear sudden howls. That's my dog. Yeah.
I love this question. I am so ready to answer this question. So, as a part of ACE Week on Tuesday, my time, I'm in New York right now. I did an Instagram live which talked about ACE affirmative therapy, and it was directed to clinicians. And we talked a little bit about this, like giving clients labels. And my thought in this is that it's important to sometimes introduce labels or language to clients who may not have it, and just offer it. So, I've had clients who've had very ACE experiences, but didn't have the language around it. So I would suggest, like, have you heard of asexuality, or have you heard of demisexuality? Have you considered, like, have you ever read anything about romantic and sexual attraction not always being the same? And given them the option of exploring it themselves without being like, I am saying that you are asexual, this is now a diagnosis. Even with diagnoses, I'm very critical of the concept of diagnoses. I know that they are helpful in a lot of ways. When I got diagnosed with PTSD, a lot made sense after the diagnosis, but the diagnosis wasn't also an official thing. It was my therapist and I having a conversation, and her being like, if I had to diagnose you with something, it would be PTSD. And I'd be like, yes, that makes sense. But even with diagnosis, I enter with a critical point of view, because most diagnoses come from the DSM, which comes from the American Psychological Association, which is supremely problematic, to the extent that even in the current diagnostic manual, there are disorders which are associated with asexuality. So even right now, asexuality is pathologized. And anything coming from America is problematic pretty much all of the time. It's created in white people world for white people and doesn't keep in account how anybody with different cultures is going to have a different experience. All of this to say that even with diagnoses, I'm not one to start diagnosing clients in my head or to them immediately, or even sometimes at all. Just recently, I was having a conversation with a client who is considering whether they could be autistic or have BPD. And my stance on this is, I don't think I'm qualified to diagnose you with either. If you want to, we can explore what that looks like. And their point was, what are you going to do if I have these diagnoses? And where I was at is like, our relationship isn't going to change. If you tell me that you have some experiences which relate to friends you have who are autistic, that's enough for me. I don't need you to have an autism diagnosis to start behaving in different ways or trying to figure out how to help those aspects which are causing you distress. So for me, labels provide language, but language can be given without the labels, if that makes sense. If we can talk about our experiences, that can have just as much of an impact as a word. And I also want to recognize I'm not anti-diagnosis. I know that it can be very helpful, help folks find community when done in the right way. So I'm critical, not anti or for. I think that the conversation needs to be directed by clients and not by our own assumptions and ideas and like trying to drill it into people's heads without them wanting it.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to continue a little bit and to place together what Shruti and Sunanda are saying. Firstly, I'm holding space for the experiences that you're sharing. Thanks a lot for that. Just to continue from Sunanda's point of having a critical point of view, completely agree with it. Not just the diagnostic part, but a critical point of view to the traditional psychotherapeutic part as well. Because the idea has been you locate a cause so that you can fix it. And this is going back to Atra's question about why do you need there to be a traumatic event for somebody who is coming out as ace to you? Why should there be trauma? Why are you looking for that so that you can fix it or what? So I think the willingness that the therapist can bring into this space to just let go of these notions, to challenge the work they're doing every day, instead of idolizing, all therapy is not it for some people. I think I just want to put that point across too, that it's not like you go to a therapeutic space and you're going to get all the answers. And then it's very important for therapists to recognize that, to let go of that arrogance that this person is coming to me and I'm going to be able to help no matter what. Sometimes that's not the case either. So how do you make space for that recognition for yourself, and how are you even able to convey that to the client? And I truly appreciate, Shruti, like you shared, that your current therapist they were angry at the misinformation that you had. And for the therapist to be able to have that space, I think it's the humanization of the therapist also, that you can react to your client not being in a healthy space previously. You don't have to have that blank screen approach at all times, or you don't have to just be passive to something very major that the client is sharing with you. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah,
Uh,
that makes sense.
can I just like add on to that a little bit? I know I'm talking a lot, so I can totally shut up as well.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Prabjot, I loved the point about like being critical of therapy space as well. I have my moments where I'm sitting and like, what field have I joined? This field has historically been so awful. Are we trying to fix a broken system which needs to be burnt down and recreated? But on that point, I think like in some ways, therapy exists because the world is broken, not because people are broken or people need to be fixed. Therapy often does sometimes feels like putting a band-aid on a much bigger issue, which comes from capitalism, comes from white supremacy, comes from Brahmanical patriarchy, and all of these different things which create a world where folks with mental health issues aren't supported, aren't community support isn't there, conversations aren't there. So I think this kind of just goes back to my initial point of my hope as a therapist is to not be needed. I don't see that happening in my lifetime, to be honest. But if a day came and my clients were like, I don't need you anymore, and I had no other clients who came to me saying, because everybody in the world is feeling better, I'd be like, oh my God, the world has changed. And that's fantastic. So I do believe that it's part of our responsibility is to help make spaces where folks can get healing, even if they don't want to be in therapy. I think somebody mentioned in the chat that they've had some really bad, they're averse to therapy because of bad therapists. There are some folks who are averse, that is very valid, and some folks who are averse to therapy because that's just not how they get their healing. And we need more spaces for healing. So not everything is on therapy.
To move on a little bit, but not exactly, I also want to talk about how just queer discourse in India affects therapy spaces, and what is it that therapists need to keep in mind when talking about queer affirmative therapy, that the discourse on queer issues in India is kind of distorted in itself. And when you see clients when you see queer clients, how you need to take, again, like it comes back to assumptions as well, how you need to keep your assumptions aside about what is being talked about in the mainstream within that discourse, because sometimes the mainstream discourse can be problematic in itself. How can therapists address this?
Can I just jump in here? I wanted to acknowledge that, yeah, I'm gonna also touch upon what Archa just raised as well. But you know, firstly, the queer discourse in this country is honestly, and everywhere else in the world, is led by cis gay men. Patriarchy still exists in queer spaces. Which is why the whole narrative of love is love is just the most reductive, most annoying, and painful, you know, condensation of the queer agenda, if I have to say so. It's just so frustrating when I hear that, because a lot of times cis gay men are still talking over me because patriarchy, you know. And secondly, a main issue where I took my identity as an ace person to the therapy room was because my family was asking me to consider getting married. And as an AFAB, there is a very real threat of, you know, sexual violence, which is trigger warning, of course, but I'm sorry I'm saying that after having mentioned it, but which is completely propped up by this institution of marriage, right? The institution of marriage supposedly promises all of these different forms of emotional, social, financial safety that are kind of guaranteed by the state, but at the same time, um, it does not acknowledge the fact that it also condones marital rape. It does it There is this idea of consummation of a marriage, which talks about, of course, sex in a very traditional way, which is penetrative sex is the way you consummate a marriage. And that is a very real systemic issue that I was confronted with, and I was just like, I cannot even consider getting married, because a lot of times when I tell my partners that I don't feel this sexual attraction to you, but I'm willing to explore it, they take it personally. They're just like, if you're not attracted to me sexually, then how can we explore? It is kind of, it affects them personally, that they don't feel desirable, right? And that is not a narrative that I wanted to bring up in a marriage, because there is so much stacked against me, as an AFAB person. That is one. And secondly, I also love that a lot of these therapists, I mean, all the therapists on this panel acknowledge that therapy is not necessarily the space for healing all the time for all people, right? There are other spaces which have to be, like, for instance, the politics of marriage in this country and the legislation of marriage definitely needs to be challenged. And therapists have informed better justice approaches and justice and legislation in this country. It has happened of late where queer affirmative therapists help educate a judge and things like that in the in the Madras High Court. So therapists definitely have a role to play outside of the therapy room, for sure. And yeah, even with the whole queer discourse, like what Harsha raised, it is dominated by cis gay men. Secondly, it's made out to be so much more about sexuality, right? And there is not enough space to talk about asexuality, where, or you're bisexual only if you are attracted to someone sexually, but you don't necessarily know how to articulate that language of attraction, articulate that language of queerness, when you don't have that sexuality to speak of. And lastly, this is a panel that I moderated yesterday on how asexuality intersects with other forms of disabilities and psychosocial disabilities included. And I think my autistic self and my asexuality is intrinsic. There is no way I can be autistic without identifying as asexual, and there's no way I can be asexual without highlighting my autistic self, because that's where it comes from. My touch averseness comes from being autistic, and it takes me a lot of time to warm up to people because I'm autistic. But at the same time, I'm very curious about sex, and that's part of my humanness, and that's the conundrum, that's the limbo in which I live in. And a lot of therapists are not able to hold space for that limbo, let alone enabling me to do it. So yeah.
Thank you.
Asha, I just wanted to, I don't know if talking about my experience with relation to medication and different forms of experience relating to access to pleasure or not having access to pleasure would be relevant here. But if you have a question ahead of the panel that sort of covers that, I'm happy to pitch in there instead of sort of talk about it now. Also, my cat's ripping the chair, but we will ignore that for now because we're in a panel. But
No, please go ahead. There is no fixed discussion that needs to be had today. It can flow.
right. Yeah. So something else that I wanted to add to the idea of how pleasure is, yes, aces and cats. Something that I want to add to the idea of how pleasure is policed is I received my diagnosis at NIMHANS, and NIMHANS was also where I was first prescribed one of the medicines that I continue to take on a long term. And my previous experience to medication had been that I had had side effects of different kinds. And I happened to be at the psychiatrist's with my mother. And my mom and I both asked, do these medicines have any side effects? And we were told by the psychiatrist that it can cause penile dysfunction and of course they said in the case of men, but nothing in the case of women. I mean, a very sort of binary way of talking about this in the first place, but also there was no mention of the fact that the medicines also lead to a very high loss of sexual desire in women. And I do sometimes wonder if the reason this was not shared with me was because I was accompanied by a parent, or simply that the whole question about women's desire is not necessarily one that has to be addressed over here, or that perhaps if you have BPD and if you're so given to making all these risky decisions, maybe it's a good thing that you happen to be on medication that reduces your libido to a certain extent. And so, for instance, thinking about things like it's possible to ask your psychiatrist to try a different medication that may not actually affect your libido in that sense was not something that was asked about. And again, I feel like if this was not pathologized to this extent, I wouldn't actually look at my medication as something that makes it completely, as something that's actually an important part of my treatment, that falls under the umbrella of treatment and helps me not have further depressive episodes. The other thing I remember, and here I'm thinking about what Sunanda was talking about, what Sunanda and Tejasvi were talking about, the institution of marriage and how it's sort of how sex is supposed to be a very sort of unspoken, seamless part of relationships and of marriage. And I remember thinking about how NIMHANS has a process of intake, because every therapist is posted there for a maximum of 3 months because they're MPhil students, and then there's a rotation and there's a new MPhil student. So if you require therapy, you also require a certain intake session. And I recall one of my intake session questions being about me and my ex-partner and about the deterioration of our relationship. And questions about it became also about how many times did you end up having sex towards when your relationship was deteriorating, because that was supposed to indicate how many times we have sex or how many times we don't have sex was supposed to indicate where the relationship was at. And so in such an instance, there wouldn't actually be space to talk about being asexual at all, because perhaps just wanting to cuddle wouldn't be seen as the mark of a good relationship necessarily. It would possibly be seen as not wanting to be with your partner in a certain way. Yeah, those were the 2 points I wanted to quickly share about this.
Yeah. So I just want to take some audience questions at the end. So we'll give it like 8-10 minutes in the end. But before that, I also want to pose the same question to Sunanda and Prabjot as well, as to how really can therapists who say they're queer affirmative can also keep in mind that, you know, the mainstream discourse, like Shruti said, when cuddling in that case wouldn't even be considered like a marker of a good relationship, and how there was no space to talk about asexuality in that case then. But this comes from the mainstream discourse that sex is the marker of a good relationship, having continuous good sex. So how can queer affirmative therapists be a little mindful about even the queer discourse that happens, and how can they not take that into account, and how can that also needs to be kept in mind when they see queer clients?
I feel like this is something which also answers a question we had in the chat of therapist neutrality, which I do not agree with at all. I am not a neutral therapist. I am not objective. I do not try to be objective. I don't want to be objective because I am a human in the room. I have my experiences. I have my biases. I have my perspectives. And especially in terms of biases, it is my responsibility to work on them. And one of the things I have so many issues with the American system of everything, but one thing I am so behind is the concept of supervisors. While I'm working, I have a supervisor I meet with weekly and talk about my cases, and they help me make sure that my biases are in check and aren't impacting my client. So one thing I would love to do when I'm working in India is to have the concept of supervision. Supervision is amazing. Peer supervision, supervision through experienced folks. It is really, really helpful. And on that point of like, how can we make more space for ACE experiences? I think it's kind of like educating therapists on a metanormativity, like the concept and trying to break that apart. So not being neutral in the space to have conversations about what feels intimate to you, what feels connective to you. What are relationships in your life which feel the strongest to you? I think one of the things which therapists end up doing is talking about significant others in terms of romantic relationships and spouses and partners, and familial. That is the end. We talk about breakups in terms of romantic partners. And where are friends in all of this? I don't know about y'all, but my friendship breakups have been a lot harder and a lot more impactful at times than any romantic breakup I have had. In terms of like the conversation around what is sex and cuddling, which is happening on the chat. I love it. I love the question of what is sex, but maybe have clients answer that question. What is sex to you? What feels pleasurable to you? Shruti, like the conversation about like how medication impacts it, like I have those conversations, understand where your clients actually at with this. What are their fears around medication? What are their hopes? And I don't know, just like have basic knowledge about this stuff so that we can help, because this is honestly really basic. We like the conversation of what makes clinicians not be queer affirmative. I am so down to have that be the regular question rather than how can you be queer affirmative to how can you not be queer affirmative? What did you do wrong? So yeah, I think part of having queer competency needs to be having understanding about asexuality, but also making like understanding that we live in a world, and especially in India, where conversations like this are hard to access. So even if you're not able to somehow, for some reason, not able to access all the details and competency around asexuality, being a therapist comes down to, and pardon my language, not being an asshole. Don't do that. Be a nice, caring human being who allows clients to decide. Don't be judgmental, like super basic stuff. If we can do that, even if we don't have the competency, then A, we're willing to get it. And B, it doesn't actively harm as much as if I don't know what asexuality is, but I'm very happy for my client to just tell me that cuddling feels very intimate to them, and that's where they're happy. And I'm like, okay, cool. If that makes you happy, we're set. Then me not knowing about asexuality isn't going to be as harmful. It's still harmful, and I would still prefer it for clinicians to know, but if I don't, it's not as harmful.
That question in the chat, where a lot of people are just saying that why do what does it even mean to be queer affirmative, and what are therapists otherwise, and why do they exist? Is I think, can we also talk about what this term means and why did this term come to be? Like, what are therapists who are not queer affirmative, or like who are anti-caste or anti-capitalist? Like, what do you do then as a therapist if you're not any of these things?
Right. I'll take that up if that's all right. Yeah. I am absolutely in agreement. Like, I don't understand why do we need to brand ourselves as queer affirmative therapist, and why the hell is literally every therapist not queer affirmative? But you know where the difference lies? The difference lies in acknowledging that there are systemic oppressions, and I'm using that word very mindfully, that contribute to your struggle as a queer person. It involves recognizing that the distress is not just in you, that there's nothing wrong with you. You've been made to feel wrong all your life. That the shame that you're carrying around your identity, are you feeling it internally, or have you been made to feel that way? Those are very different questions. So just like that, focus on how I understand the context, not just the problem that you're bringing in. And again, going back to, it's not for me to diagnose and not for me to fix, just holding space. Non-queer affirmative therapists are into that mode of action, into that mode of, okay, what can I do to make it better for you? You're coming out to me, so must be a point of distress for you. How can I fix it? How can I do that? But queer affirmative therapy is a lot about, I genuinely feel, just being in the session with the client, and going back to the question that you previously asked, I think it's about witnessing their reality. It's about bearing witness to that instead of trying to change it in any manner. It's about extending that sort of validation that I listened, I'm hearing you right now, I believe you. It doesn't matter to me if cuddling is all that it is that you need. I mean, I cannot possibly have the moral authority to tell you that that's not it. So just like dumping all notions of morality, especially I think in the Indian context, is what would take for it to just be a space where you can witness of somebody's story, where you can laugh with them, where you can share their excitement, where you can share that joy, where you can express your emotion. Going back to what Sunanda was saying about, neutrality is almost harmful. So non-queer affirmative folks are therapists are neutral. They're at best tolerant. They're not appreciating your identity. They're not affirming it in ways that queer affirmative therapists would. And of course, goes without saying that every therapist should be queer affirmative.
Yeah.
This is like the queer discussion, Do queer people need to come out? No, maybe you should come out as queerphobic or homophobic. Similarly, I feel like I don't know. I just feel like instead of calling yourself a queer affirmative therapist, maybe you should be like, no, I'm a politically neutral, patriarchy loving therapist, something.
Yeah, I mean, and so much of what Sunanda and Prabjot said reminds me of how differently I felt about one psychiatrist who, while well recommended, also said to me, your self-awareness is both remarkable and unnerving. And I remember thinking, do they actually think that, do they actually just wish for us to be willfully foolish, and it's only that presenting as that'll help you seem like a pliant client? And on the other hand, my most recent experience with a psychiatrist involved them saying, you've literally had this since you were 17 years old, and you probably know a lot more about what you experience than me or a lot of other mental health professionals. What can you tell me about this? And that's probably the first time that someone actually asked me that question and held space for me to talk about it. And I had so much information to tell them, because otherwise it can feel like you're talking to a devil's advocate, and you constantly have to push back. And I don't want to carry evidence-backed studies about my lived experience. I don't want my discussion with a psychiatrist to be, no, but it's not like that. No, but actually it is. That's a lot of money. Like, that's a lot of money being paid to re-traumatize oneself. So yeah, I'm glad that I don't actually think it's that hard to offer space. I don't think it is that hard to erode that the very strict idea of power between client and therapist or client and psychiatrist. But some people clearly have a very, very big chip on their shoulder and are
Yeah.
often not okay with your heightened self-awareness.
Thank you, Shruti. We just have like 4 minutes left. Uh, Sunanda, I know you want to say something. No, it's okay. Can you just quickly say it, and then I can just close it up.
Yeah, I just love what Shruti you said about power dynamics. And there's this idea in when you walk into a therapy room, there's this clear dynamic that the therapist has power, the client doesn't. And I think as therapists, it's our responsibility to try and balance that in whatever way we can, which starts by doing the thing which your new non-asshole psychiatrist did of like, you are your expert, tell me about yourself.
Yeah. Thank you to all of you who not only shared your experiences, but also the therapists who questioned therapy in itself. I think a lot was spoken today, but the main things that I remember are that a therapist shouldn't have presumptions about how queer clients are supposed to behave, or if they are even queer enough to fit into that label, and how that in itself can be extremely harmful in the space itself. um, I love what Prabjot said about how you shouldn't be looking for trauma when it comes to an asexual client who identifies on the A spectrum. You shouldn't be trying to fix anything when it comes to queer identities. Um, how the mainstream queer discourse in itself is so harmful that you need to be careful about what you refer to or what you look at when you talk to your queer clients. Not just that, but also the other thing about also just sorry, 1 second. My dog has woken up from her sleep. Sorry. But yeah, just I think how we still refer to DSM mainly, which is a white people handbook of mental health, and how not all problems are white people problems, and how it needs to be, you need to be extremely careful when I'm so sorry. You need to be extremely careful. Yes, therapy dogs in discussion. When you're in a therapeutic space. Okay, thank you. Uh, Again, I'm so sorry. But yes, I think that was it for today. And thank you so much for coming to the panel. Yes.
Thank you for having me, for us. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was so cool.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I mean, the therapy cats and doggos made their appearance today as well. So awesome. Before we leave, there is an information that I need to share. The next session is going to be a workshop on mental health and asexuality. If you're interested, please do join. It's going to be an interesting one. So that's it from my side. Bye.
Yes,
Bye.
please, everybody who's interested, please come back in a few minutes after we're done with a short break and some technical checks. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.